The pen was trembling above the form, though it was not in my hand. It was in his. The psychiatrist's office smelled faintly of eucalyptus disinfectant, cold and clinical, like every particle of warmth had been scrubbed away to make space for sterile judgment. The fluorescent light above my head buzzed with a rhythm that reminded me of an insect caught inside a jar. The doctor's voice, calm and rehearsed, said once again, "Her family reports disorientation, confusion, paranoia." I could hear each word as if it were dripping into a glass of water already too full. He was standing close enough behind me that I could feel the static of his shirt brushing my shoulder. I had my bag on my lap, my hand resting on it casually, but my thumb was pressing against the hidden screen of my phone. 23 minutes of recording had already passed. The red numbers were counting my survival. If I didn't have that evidence, my words would mean nothing. I knew that as clearly as I knew the air in that room was colder than outside São Paulo's humid July afternoon. "Please, honey, do the right thing. We will help you," he whispered in Portuguese, but loud enough for the doctor to hear the tenderness in his tone. The mask of a man deeply concerned. If I had screamed then, they would have written agitation in their notes. If I had stayed silent, they would have written withdrawn. Either way, the cage would close, not with iron bars but with a medical signature. So I asked for water. It gave me a few seconds. The psychiatrist nodded at the nurse who walked out to fetch it. And in that small silence, I did the only thing that kept me tethered to reality. I told them a date. June 3rd, 2019. A night in our small 2-bedroom apartment in Paraíso. A night when he first asked me to lie for him. The memory wasn't just in my head. I had proof, but let me take you back. It didn't start with hospitals or psychiatrists or cold fluorescent lights. It began with a smile, a kindness that looked genuine, an ordinary afternoon in 2016 when I was 28 and still full of unbroken trust. I was working as a junior copywriter, earning $4,800 a month, proud of being able to finally help my mother with groceries, saving coins in a jar labeled Lisboa trip that I thought would take me to Europe the following year. He arrived in my life during a volunteer program at a school in Muka. He remembered children's names. He laughed at my grandmother's stories about sewing dresses in the 80s. He seemed different from the rushed men I usually met in bars. By 2017, when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer and I spent Fridays escorting her to Hospital São Paulo for chemotherapy, he was there. He drove us, never accepting gas money, holding her hand when she felt faint. That's how the door opens, not with a blow but with a blanket laid carefully across your shoulders. Gratitude blurred my vision. I thought love meant writing over the small doubts with a thick marker of loyalty. By 2018, we moved in together. A modest place, $2,300 rent split in theory, but mostly covered by me when his work was slow. I didn't mind. He cooked pasta on Sundays, made playlists for us to dance barefoot in the living room, whispered that my laugh filled every empty corner of his life. When he met my father, he promised, "I'll protect her." And I believed him. Then came June 3rd, 2019. He asked me to tell someone he was home on a night he wasn't. "Just a misunderstanding," he murmured, pressing his hand lightly on my knee. "If my client asks, I need to be covered." It was said so casually, like borrowing a pen, but my stomach clenched. I refused. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and changed the subject to curtains. Days later, I found a bar receipt in his pocket. Pinheiros, exactly during the time he asked me to lie. The stone dropped into my stomach then, and it never left. From there, it wasn't thunder but drizzle. A steady erosion of my boundaries disguised as love. In 2020, when the pandemic hit and he claimed all his contracts collapsed, I paid most of the bills. I did it willingly because wasn't that what couples did? But slowly, his comments shifted. "Maybe stop visiting your aunt, you need rest." "I'll manage our calendar. You forget things anyway." To my sister, he confided, "She's been moody, maybe overwhelmed." It was subtle, so subtle that I doubted myself. And then, one January evening in 2021, while the fan clicked in the heat, he half joked, "Sometimes I think your memory is slipping. You mix dates." Laughter in his voice, but a seed planted. March 2022 was the impossible request. He sat me down at our small chipped table, the same where we once scribbled travel plans, and asked me to co-sign a loan, $48,000. Only for a few months, he promised. You'll be showing me you're committed. Commitment. That word felt like a blade. I refused. He moved to the couch, slept turned away from me for days. That was the week I created the secret Google Drive folder titled April Laundry. Inside, I began dropping receipts, screenshots, notes, voice memos. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down I knew it was breadcrumbs in a dark forest. December 2022, the thread pulled loose. Cleaning the wardrobe, I found a blue notebook wrapped in an old scarf. Inside, lists, phrases. She forgets appointments. She gets overwhelmed. She describes smells not there. Next to them, names. My sister, his mother, our neighbor. Conversations I had never had. He was building a case. A case where I was unstable. My knees buckled on the floor with that notebook in my hands. I listened to an audio recording from September where he apologized for calling me crazy during an argument. Clear as sunlight. Yet the very next day, he told his cousin I had imagined it. When I confronted him with the notebook, he gave me a look of pity that curdled my blood. "I'm worried about you," he said softly. "Maybe it's time for evaluation." And so, July 18th, 2023 arrived. He had a folder with my name, filled with stories I didn't recognize, presented in the calm voice of a savior. The psychiatrist looked at me. "Is any of this true?" he asked. The nurse returned with my plastic cup of water. I took a sip, the cup bending in my hand, and I said again, June 3rd, 2019. The first lie he asked me to tell. The first stone. But that day, for the first time, I wasn't the only one who heard my truth. The second audio file I played that afternoon was only 3 minutes long, but it felt like the weight of 3 years condensed into a trembling recording. The psychiatrist leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced, his face betraying nothing but the subtle tightening of his eyes. On the screen of my phone, the date read, September 4th, 2022, 11:14 p.m. You could hear the echo of our small living room, the whir of the ceiling fan, and his voice, low and deliberate, saying, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my voice. You know how stressed I am. I'll never do it again." He had denied ever saying those words. He told his cousin, 2 days later, that I had fabricated the entire scene, but there it was. His voice, my silence, the pause between sentences when I was too exhausted to argue, proof that memory was not the fragile thing he insisted it was, proof that truth had a spine. The psychiatrist asked him to step outside. He bristled, protested, but finally left the room, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might break. The air seemed to grow lighter in his absence, though it still buzzed with the residue of his control. The doctor turned to me, voice softer now, and asked, "How often do you record?" My throat tightened, but I answered, "Only when I feel the ground tilting. When I know tomorrow he'll tell me it happened differently, that I imagined, that I confused dates." I showed him the folder names on my phone. April laundry, July groceries, September shoes, names designed to be invisible. Each one contained audio files, screenshots, photos of receipts, metadata with dates and hours that could not be erased by words. I told him about March 2022, about the $48,000 loan request, about the chipped table and the silence that followed my refusal. I described my mother's chemotherapy cycles, the smell of bleach in her apartment, the bus rides from Ipiranga back to Paraíso when I held back tears so she wouldn't see them. I told him about how my card was declined at a bakery because I had paid our rent twice in 1 month, while he waited for a transfer that never came. I confessed how guilty I felt for suspecting him, how love made me rewrite reality until it barely resembled itself. He asked me, "When did you first realize the story he tells about you is not the story you live in?" The question lingered like smoke. I could see the exact moment. June 3rd, 2019. The receipt from the bar in Pinheiros. The ease with which he asked me to cover for him. The stone that sank in my stomach. That was when I understood there were 2 versions of me. The one who existed, and the one he was narrating into existence for everyone else. The psychiatrist nodded slowly, scribbled something in his notes, and then, almost cautiously, asked, "Do you have a safe place to stay?" I swallowed hard. My sister's apartment, 2 metro lines away. Small, messy, but real. I nodded. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine leaving. When he came back into the room, his smile was polished, his voice dripping with indignation masked as concern. "Doctor, she manipulates everything. What kind of person records the one they love? This is proof of her instability. Who does that?" He gestured at my phone like it was a weapon, but the psychiatrist didn't hand him the form this time. Instead, he folded his hands and suggested something different. Couples counseling, an independent evaluation, a later date. His tone was neutral, but I felt the shift. I felt it in the way my stomach uncoiled slightly, in the way his jaw twitched. He had expected a signature today, an ending written in ink. Instead, he had to walk out with me free. I stood up, clutching my bag, the plastic cup still crumpled in my fist like a crushed artifact of survival. He called my name softly as I opened the door, but I didn't turn. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, normal smells that felt extraordinary because they meant I was still in the world. Outside, São Paulo roared as if nothing had happened. Cars honked. A woman sold coconut water from a cart. The sun hit the pavement and turned the air into waves. I walked out into that ordinary chaos, my phone vibrating in my pocket. A message from my sister blinked on the screen. "Are you out?" I typed back 4 words. "I have proof, finally." That night, I sat on her couch with the city's noise muffled by her thin curtains. We drank cheap wine, the kind that stains your lips purple, and I played the recordings for her. She cried, not because she was surprised, but because she had doubted me too. "He told me you were mixing up things," she whispered. "He said you were forgetting dates, making up conversations." The guilt in her eyes hurt more than his betrayal. I realized then the scope of it. It wasn't just me. He had poisoned the ground beneath my entire family, one whispered comment at a time. Manipulation is not fire. It is water, seeping silently into walls until they crumble. And I had been living inside a house ready to collapse. For hours, my sister and I talked, piecing together the small lies he had planted. Times when he had told her I was too tired to visit. Moments when he had insisted to my father that I was struggling with focus. Even the neighbor upstairs had once hinted, "He worries about you a lot. You're lucky to have him." I thought it was kindness. Now I saw it as scaffolding for a trap. When the wine bottle was empty and the city had grown quiet, I looked at the ceiling and felt the kind of exhaustion that is heavier than sleep. I wasn't free yet. He would fight. He would twist, deny, threaten. But for the first time, I had something that couldn't be erased. His own voice, captured in moments when the mask slipped. That night, I whispered to myself, "You are not crazy." I repeated it like a prayer. Because for years, I had lived inside a version of myself he had written for everyone else. And I was finally tearing the pages out. The days that followed that clinic confrontation were not a relief. Not yet. Freedom does not arrive with one unlocked door. It arrives slowly, in pieces, while the shadow of the cage still follows you. I stayed with my sister in her cramped apartment near Villa Mariana, the kind of place where the kitchen table is also the desk, and where you can hear the metro rumble beneath the floor at night. She made me black coffee in the mornings, stronger than I usually drank, as if bitterness itself could keep me awake and alert. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened. His name still appeared on the screen, messages disguised as tenderness. "Please, come back. You know I only want to help you." Other times, threats coated in sugar. "If you leave things like this, people will think you're unwell." I knew he was right about one thing. People already thought that. My father's voice on the phone was cautious. "He's just worried about you, Filha. Maybe you should at least listen to him. Doctors can help." The betrayal in his tone wasn't intentional. It was the echo of years of small seeds planted. Seeds that grew into doubts, even in those who loved me most. That was his genius. He never shouted, never accused directly. He whispered, carefully, consistently, until reality bent toward his version. It was in those days, late July 2023, that I began combing through the recordings and files I had hidden. I sat cross-legged on my sister's rug, laptop balanced on my knees, headphones pressed tight against my ears as if I were listening to some secret transmission from the past. Each file was another blow, but also another stone in the wall I was building against him. March 19, 2022. His voice pressing me to sign the $48,000 loan. "If you love me, you'll do it," he said. And when I resisted, the muttered insult he denied later was clear in the recording. May 11, 2023. Him on speakerphone with a friend, strategizing how to convince my sister I was unstable. "She's tired. She mixes things. I'll take over for her," he said casually, as though he were planning a dinner. Hearing it again, with the distance of safety around me, I realized just how calculated it all was. It wasn't madness or accident. It was architecture. He was building a reality brick by brick, where I was the unreliable narrator of my own life, and he was the rescuer who bore the burden of caring for me. If the clinic had accepted his story that day, if the psychiatrist had signed the form, my voice would have been erased under the stamp of medical authority. That thought kept me awake some nights, staring at the cracked ceiling paint, listening to the faint sounds of São Paulo breathing through the window. But paranoia and vigilance are cousins. I began to document everything systematically. I exported the audios, duplicated them, saved them in cloud drives under names like grocery lists and trip budgets. I even sent a copy to an old friend abroad, framing it as a backup in case my computer failed. The fear of losing evidence was greater than the fear of him finding me. Every whisper of his manipulation became a file. Every receipt, every text message where dates contradicted each other, every apology he later denied. It all became part of a map of survival. Meanwhile, he tried to lure me back. Flowers delivered to my sister's building with notes written in his familiar looping handwriting. "No one will ever love you like I do." Calls at odd hours, switching from pleading to anger in the same breath. "You're sick. You don't even realize it." Then softer, "Come home. We can fix this." He knew exactly how to alternate the tones, how to play the strings he had tuned over years of my loyalty. One night in early August, I walked past our old apartment. I stood across the street, hidden by the shadow of a tree, watching the balcony where I used to hang clothes to dry. A light was on in the living room. I could see his silhouette moving, talking on the phone, gesturing as though commanding an audience. My chest tightened with a mixture of grief and rage. That space had once been filled with Sunday laughter, playlists, pasta sauce simmering on the stove. Now it looked like a stage where he rehearsed stories about my supposed collapse. I turned away quickly, but not before realizing something else. I didn't want that apartment back. The idea of stepping into that space again felt like drowning. It was around then that my sister suggested I speak to a lawyer. The word felt heavy, like a weapon I wasn't sure how to hold. But after weeks of sorting through audios and realizing how deep the manipulation had gone, I agreed. The lawyer's office was in a narrow building near Praça da Sé, with dusty books stacked behind glass cases. She listened quietly as I explained, her pen moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. When I played her one of the recordings, she raised her eyebrows slightly, but said nothing until it ended. Then she said, "What he attempted is not just emotional manipulation. If he tried to commit you under false pretenses, and you have proof, that is abuse. It can be challenged." Her words should have felt like fire, but instead they felt like cold water. The possibility of exposing him meant stepping into a battlefield. My body wanted to curl inward, to stay hidden, to not poke the beast. But another part of me, the part that had whispered into my own ear, "You are not crazy," began to stir. The hardest part wasn't convincing the law. It was convincing myself. Each time I listened to the audios, I could hear his other voice too. The one that laughed with me, that cooked pasta, that drove my mother to appointments. My heart twisted with confusion. Was that version of him ever real? Or was it just another mask, another line in a carefully crafted script? Late one night, unable to sleep, I replayed the September 4th recording again. the apology he denied. His voice said, "I'll never do it again." And I whispered back to the empty room, "But you did." And I kept every word. That was when I realized the audios weren't just proof for others. They were proof for me. Proof that my memories were intact, that my reality had a spine, that love had not made me hallucinate. The evidence was a mirror, showing me the bruises he had tried to convince me weren't there. The next morning, I opened a new folder on my laptop. I didn't hide this one. I titled it Truth, and I began to plan how I would use it. The folder named Truth sat like a live wire on my laptop. Opening it gave me both nausea and strength. Every file inside it was a fragment of survival, yet each fragment cut me anew. I remember the first time I decided to play one of the recordings for someone outside the family. It was mid-August 2023, the air sticky and restless, the city simmering under the weight of another endless week. I was sitting in a cafe near Avenida Paulista with Camila, a colleague I hadn't spoken to much since leaving the agency earlier that year. She always had a quick smile, but that afternoon her expression was guarded, almost hesitant, as if she too had heard whispers. I placed my phone on the table between us, my hands trembling. "Just listen," I said. She hesitated, then pressed play. It was the March 19th, 2022 audio. The loan request, his soft insistence, his manipulation wrapped in tenderness. We listened in silence while people around us clattered cups and typed on laptops. When it ended, she didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "He told me you were having problems, that you were under a lot of stress. But this is different." She leaned forward. "You need to show this to more people." That moment cracked the wall he had built around me. If Camilla could hear his voice and understand, maybe others could too. The realization burned, because it meant years of doubting myself had been unnecessary. But it also gave me a mission, to make the truth undeniable. The escalation came swiftly after that. He must have felt the shift, sensed that I was no longer isolated. Suddenly, posts appeared on his social media, vague insinuations about mental health, about how hard it was to love someone who was struggling. Friends liked and commented with sympathy. Some of them even messaged me privately, asking if I was okay, their words dripping with the doubt he had seeded. He was painting me publicly as unstable, a woman unraveling, and himself as the patient savior. The rage that rose inside me then was hotter than anything I had ever felt. Rage not just at him, but at myself for ever believing his gentleness was truth, but anger can be fuel. I gathered my files and began crafting a timeline. I listed dates, cross-referenced them with receipts, messages, and audios. I built a chronology so meticulous it could not be dismissed as confusion. Each entry was a nail in the coffin of his lies. One night, my sister and I stayed up until dawn, papers and screenshots spread across her kitchen table. The small room smelled of instant coffee and exhaustion. "He was building a case," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He wanted everyone to think you were crazy." She pressed her hands to her face, and I almost believed him. I touched her shoulder. "That's what he does. He makes people doubt the ground they walk on." The unexpected twist came when I discovered he had already tried to file a preliminary report at the police station in our district, suggesting I was a danger to myself. I only found out because a friend who worked at the station recognized my name and called me quietly. The thought that he was one step away from legalizing his narrative chilled me to the bone. If I hadn't had the recordings, if the psychiatrist had believed him that day in July, I could have been locked away, silenced behind institutional walls. It was then that my lawyer moved quickly. We prepared a formal complaint, attaching the audios, the notebook I had found, and testimony from my sister. I remember the morning we walked into the courthouse, September 5th, 2023. The marble floor was cold under my shoes, the echo of footsteps loud in the vast hall. I clutched the USB drive like a lifeline. My lawyer's heels clicked steadily ahead of me, each sound a reminder that I was no longer walking this road alone. Presenting the evidence felt surreal. The judge listened quietly as the first audio played, his face impassive. My ex sat on the opposite bench, hands folded, his mask of calm cracking just slightly at the edges. The courtroom smelled of paper and old wood, and the hum of the air conditioner reminded me of the clinic months earlier. Except this time, I wasn't alone with his story. This time, the walls heard my version too. When the September 4th recording played, the one where he apologized for raising his voice, something shifted. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. My ex shook his head, whispering furiously to his lawyer. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely breathe. For years he had told me I was confused, forgetful, unstable. Now his own voice betrayed him in front of strangers who had no reason to doubt me. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel victorious yet. The case wasn't decided. The process was far from over. But I felt something I hadn't in years. Grounded. My reality was no longer only mine. Others had heard it, confirmed it, acknowledged it. That acknowledgement was oxygen. That night, back at my sister's apartment, I stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker like restless stars. I whispered into the glass, "You tried to bury me in silence, but I turned your words into my weapon." For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the broken one. Maybe I was the survivor. And survival, I realized, was not just about breathing. It was about reclaiming the narrative of your own life. The confrontation came in layers, not all at once, like the slow tearing of fabric you thought would hold forever. By late September 2023, the case had begun to draw whispers in our circle of friends. Some who had once sided with him grew distant, their silence speaking louder than loyalty. Others, cautiously, began to ask me questions they had never dared before. Was it true you were forgetting things? Did you really accuse the neighbors of spying? Each question stung, because it showed how deeply he had planted his narrative. Yet each answer I gave, supported by the files and audios, loosened another knot in the web he had spun. It was a Thursday when everything reached the boiling point. The hearing had been scheduled in a small courtroom near Liberdade, the kind of place that smelled of old paper and disinfectant, with buzzing lights that hummed just above the range of comfort. I wore black slacks and a pale blouse, simple clothes that wouldn't speak louder than my words. My sister sat behind me, her presence steady, while he entered the room in a navy suit, crisp and immaculate, his expression carefully curated into that of a man weary but noble. He glanced at me only once, and in that glance I saw both the arrogance of someone who still believed he could control the narrative and the flicker of fear that maybe he couldn't. The judge called the session to order. His lawyer began with eloquence, painting me as a fragile woman overwhelmed by family illness and economic strain, whose recordings were out of context and manipulated. He spoke of my episodes of confusion, his voice dipping into the exact notes of concern my ex had always used. It was nauseating to hear my life reduced to a story of weakness, a story crafted in his image, delivered with the authority of legal rhetoric. Then it was my turn. My lawyer stood tall, her voice sharp but calm. She presented the first file. The audio filled the room, my ex's voice urging me to sign the loan, his tenderness slipping into coercion, his muttered insult caught by the microphone. For the first time, his mask faltered in public. He shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, eyes flicking toward the judge as if to gauge the reaction. The second audio was worse for him. September 4th, 2022. The apology he had denied. His voice saying, "I'm sorry. I'll never do it again." My silence afterward, heavy and unmistakable. When it ended, the room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. The judge leaned forward slightly. "This is your voice, correct?" My ex hesitated for a second too long before nodding. That hesitation was a crack big enough for daylight to pour through. He tried to recover, of course. He raised his voice, something he rarely did in public. "She records me without consent. This is invasion, manipulation." But even as he spoke, his tone betrayed him. The calm concern was gone, replaced by agitation he couldn't mask. For years he had controlled the story by controlling tone, by being the reasonable one, the steady one. Now, with every word, he revealed the anger underneath. I looked at him then, really looked, and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. His words didn't land the way they used to. They bounced off the shield of evidence I had built. of witnesses who now heard for themselves what I had lived. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't a trap. It was a stage where his performance was collapsing. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't recite rehearsed lines. I told the truth in the simplest way I could. I spoke of June 3, 2019, the bar receipt, the first lie he asked me to tell. I spoke of the chipped kitchen table and the impossible loan request, of the nights spent by my mother's side while he whispered to others that I was losing touch with reality. I described the notebook wrapped in the scarf, the lists of fabricated symptoms attributed to me, the names of people he had drawn into his narrative. My voice trembled at times, but I did not break. I ended with a sentence I hadn't planned. For years, he told me I was forgetting things, but I didn't forget. I remembered everything, and now you can hear it too. Silence followed. It was heavy, electric, the kind of silence that means something has shifted irreversibly. The judge nodded once, then announced a recess. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun hit my face. Reporters weren't waiting. This wasn't that kind of case. But the air smelled different, sharper, freer. My sister hugged me tightly, whispering, "They believe you now." I saw it in their faces. I wanted to believe it too, but I knew the war wasn't over. He would fight back, twist the narrative again, find new ways to portray himself as the victim. But something fundamental had changed. The story was no longer his alone to tell. That night, back at my sister's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying the moment in court, when his voice cracked under the weight of his own lies. For so long, I had feared I would never be heard, that I would vanish under the label of unstable. Now, even if the process dragged on, even if people still whispered, I knew the truth had escaped into the world. It was no longer trapped inside me, no longer just a folder on my laptop. I stood by the window, looking out at the restless lights of São Paulo, and whispered into the glass, "You tried to rewrite me, but your own words rewrote you." And in that moment, I realized the power of survival wasn't just in enduring, it was in reclaiming the story, in ripping it back from the hands that twisted it, and holding it up in the light. The courtroom was just the beginning. The real war unfolded in the spaces between, the phone calls, the family dinners, the subtle glances exchanged by people who weren't sure what to believe. After that hearing in September 2023, I noticed the silence more than the noise. Some cousins stopped calling altogether. Old friends who used to send me memes late at night now only liked his vague social media posts about carrying burdens no one sees. He was clever. He never mentioned my name directly, but his words painted me in shadows. Sometimes love means protecting someone from themselves. The hardest thing is watching the person you love slip away. Each post gathered sympathetic comments, hands reaching out to comfort him while I sat in my sister's apartment, feeling invisible in plain sight. But I wasn't invisible anymore. The audios had changed the dynamic. My lawyer insisted we compile everything into a single file. Dates, names, receipts, bank statements. Every shred of truth. She called it a dossier, but to me it felt like a survival manual. At night, I spread the documents across the kitchen table like puzzle pieces. The glow from the overhead bulb cast long shadows, and my sister sometimes fell asleep on the couch while I kept arranging, highlighting, cross-checking. Every click of the highlighter felt like reclaiming a heartbeat I had lost to his manipulation. The hardest part, though, was my father. He had always liked him. "He's responsible," he told neighbors. "He takes care of her." Those words now burned. When I visited my parents one Sunday in October, the air smelled of beans simmering on the stove, the same comfort I'd known since childhood. But the conversation at the table was sharp. My father looked at me with eyes full of doubt and said, "He called me, Filha. He says he only wants you to get help. Are you sure this isn't your imagination?" My chest tightened so violently I thought I might choke. I wanted to scream, to play the audios right there, but I knew that forcing it would only sound like hysteria. Instead, I whispered, "Come to the next hearing. Listen for yourself." That night I cried into my sister's pillow, not just because my father doubted me, but because I realized how close I had come to losing everyone. Manipulation doesn't just target the victim, it poisons the soil around them until roots of trust rot away. That was his plan all along, to leave me so isolated that any protest would sound like madness. But cracks began to show in his mask. In late October, one of his friends reached out to me privately. She had seen the evidence file my lawyer had submitted and wanted to apologize. "He told us you were unstable," she admitted, her voice shaky over the phone. "But hearing those recordings, it's different. I believe you." Her words were a balm I didn't know I needed. For the first time, someone outside my immediate circle said the words, "I believe you." November arrived heavy with rain. The city streets were slick, and I often found myself walking for hours, umbrella trembling in the wind, trying to process everything. One evening, as thunder rolled above the high-rises, I listened again to the May 11th, 2023 recording, his voice telling a friend he planned to convince my sister I was tired, confused. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, rain soaking my shoes, and thought, he tried to steal not just my voice, but my family, my safety, my very reflection. Rage surged so fiercely I felt it in my teeth. By mid-November, another hearing was scheduled. This time my father attended. He sat stiff in his chair, arms crossed, while the audios played. I watched his face carefully. When the September 4th apology echoed through the speakers, something changed in his eyes. His jaw softened, his shoulders slumped. Afterward, he didn't speak much, but when we left the courthouse, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Just one gesture, heavy with unsaid words. That night he called me. His voice cracked as he said, "I should have believed you sooner." Those words nearly broke me. Not in pain this time, but in release. For years, my father's approval had been a compass. Knowing he had been swayed by lies had cut deeper than anything else. Hearing him admit his doubt, then return to me, was a quiet victory greater than the court. But my ex didn't stop. He doubled down. He filed countersuits, accusing me of defamation, insisting the audios were edited. He even showed up outside my sister's building one evening, flowers in hand, face twisted into that old mask of gentle concern. "Come home," he begged, his voice trembling. "This isn't you. You're sick. Let's fix this together." I didn't open the door. I watched him from the window, my hands shaking but steady enough to press record on my phone again. His persistence was its own evidence now. The weight of it all pressed on me. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if survival was worth this endless war. But then I'd hear his voice in the recordings, dripping with manipulation. And I'd remember, if I stopped, he would win. And winning for him meant erasing me entirely. In December 2023, my lawyer told me something that made me tremble. The prosecutor had agreed to admit the audios as central evidence, not just supporting material. "It changes everything," she said, sliding papers across her desk. The clinical smell of the courthouse, the long nights of cataloging files, the doubt in my father's eyes. It all condensed into that one sentence. It changes everything. That night, I walked home in the drizzle, the streets shining under neon signs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost drifting through someone else's narrative. I felt real. I felt present. And though the war wasn't over, I knew something irreversible had happened. His voice, once my torment, had become my salvation. I whispered into the night air, "You tried to call me crazy, but every word you spoke proves I am sane." The first time the audios left the courtroom and my family's ears, it wasn't planned. It was a leak. A quiet ripple that turned into a storm. December 15th, 2023, I woke up to my sister shaking me awake, her phone screen glowing in the half-dark of her apartment. "It's out," she whispered, eyes wide. I rubbed my eyes, still groggy, and saw a WhatsApp group thread open on her phone. The audio from March 19th, 2022, the one where he demanded I sign the $48,000 loan, was playing in the group chat of some mutual friends. His voice, soft but insistent, followed by the slip of rage. "If you love me, you'll do it." My stomach dropped. Fear and relief wrestled inside me. Fear, because now it was public. beyond my control. Relief, because the truth was no longer contained. It was alive, moving through other people's phones, ears, minds. My sister squeezed my arm. "People are listening," she said. By noon that day, I had received 5 messages from friends who had distanced themselves months ago. One wrote simply, "I'm sorry. I believe you now." Another said, "He told us you were confused." I feel sick hearing this. The silence that had wrapped around me for so long was breaking. In its place came the noise of recognition, of people forced to confront that the man they admired was not the saint he portrayed. He reacted swiftly, as I knew he would. That same afternoon, his social media filled with long posts about betrayal, about private life being twisted and exploited. He claimed I had fabricated the recordings, that I was obsessed with destroying him. He posted a photo of us from 2018, me laughing, his arm around me, captioned, "This is what real love looked like before sickness took her away." It gathered hundreds of likes. The comments split in half, some consoling him, others questioning, many sharing the audios in the replies. For the first time, his control cracked in public. The fallout spread like wildfire. Relatives began calling my parents, demanding explanations. Some accused me of humiliating the family. Others whispered that maybe I had been right all along. My mother, frail from her treatments but sharp as ever, told me on the phone, "I don't care what anyone says. I know my daughter. I always knew something was wrong with him." Her voice gave me strength I hadn't felt since childhood, the kind that anchors you when the storm is strongest. But with exposure came danger. In early January 2024, he showed up at my workplace, my new job at a small marketing firm in Villa Olympia, demanding to speak with me. He stood in the lobby, bouquet in hand, his voice raised just enough to draw attention. "She's confused. She's sick. She needs help," he told the receptionist, loud enough that coworkers whispered in the hallways later. I didn't go down. Instead, I sent a message to my lawyer, who filed for a restraining order the very next day. The audios had shifted the power dynamic, but he was still thrashing, desperate to regain control. The restraining order was granted 2 weeks later. The relief I felt when the judge's gavel hit the desk was unlike anything else. It was official now, a legal line he could not cross without consequence. Still, my body carried the memory of fear. Each time I walked home, I checked behind me. Each time the phone rang late at night, I flinched. Survival teaches you vigilance that doesn't fade overnight. Yet something else was growing inside me. Defiance. The more the audios spread, the more people whispered. Not about me, but about him. His reputation, once polished and spotless, now carried stains he couldn't scrub out. Invitations dried up. Business contacts distanced themselves. One of his own cousins sent me a message. "We see him differently now. I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner." One evening in late January, I was invited to speak, not in a courtroom, but at a women's support group in the city. A small circle of chairs, dim lighting, the smell of coffee and biscuits filling the room. I pressed play on one of the shorter audios, my voice shaking as I explained what it was like to live in a reality rewritten by someone else. When it ended, there was silence. Then a woman across from me, maybe in her 40s, with tired eyes, said softly, "He sounds exactly like my ex." Another nodded. "Mine too." It was then that I realized my story was not just mine. It was a mirror. As February came, the case still dragged on in the courts, but the balance had shifted. My father attended every hearing now, his presence solid. My sister became my fiercest defender, confronting relatives who whispered doubts. And I, once voiceless, was now the one carrying recordings that could silence lies. The twist I hadn't expected came on a rainy morning in March 2024. My lawyer called me, her voice charged with urgency. "One of the psychiatrists he tried to use against you has submitted a statement. He admitted your ex pressured him, exaggerated symptoms, twisted details." My knees buckled. Proof, not just from my audios, but from the very system my ex tried to weaponize. The irony was brutal. The institution he wanted to lock me inside of had turned against him. That night, I stood on my sister's balcony, the city lights smeared by rain, and whispered, "You wanted me silenced. Now the world is listening." I knew then that whatever came next, trial, appeals, more attempts to twist the story, he could never fully erase the truth again. His voice was already out there, betraying him more effectively than I ever could. And for the first time, I began to imagine a future not defined by fear, but by choice. Freedom does not come like the slam of a door opening. It comes in fragments, jagged pieces that cut as much as they heal. After March 2024, when the psychiatrist's statement surfaced and the restraining order held him at bay, I thought I would feel light. Instead, I felt the weight of everything he had taken pressing down on me even more. My sister said I was free now. My lawyer said the case was leaning in my favor. But every night, as I lay in her small apartment, listening to the muffled hum of São Paulo traffic, I still half expected my phone to buzz with another one of his messages. "You're sick. You're confused. Without me, you're nothing." His words still echoed even in his absence, like graffiti sprayed on the walls of my mind. By April, the audios had spread further than I ever imagined. They weren't on the news. This was not a scandal for the public eye. But among friends, relatives, even co-workers, the truth had become impossible to silence. People who once averted their gaze when I entered a room now looked at me differently. Some with pity, others with respect, a few with shame for having doubted me. At family gatherings, there were awkward silences that spoke louder than words. My uncle, who once called me fragile, now avoided meeting my eyes. My father, on the other hand, became my shadow, protective in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. He brought me coffee during court recesses, held my bag while I presented documents, his quiet way of saying, "I believe you now." But the exposure brought scars, too. Trust had been shattered in places I didn't expect. When I walked through the market near Ipiranga one Saturday morning, I overheard two neighbors whispering, "She recorded her own husband." "Who does that?" Their tone was disapproving, as if the act of protecting myself was the betrayal, not the years of manipulation I endured. That cut deep. People often prefer the neatness of silence to the mess of truth. In May, the court scheduled another major hearing. This time, more witnesses were called. Friends, relatives, even my old boss from the agency. I sat there in the stiff wooden chair, heart pounding as each of them spoke. Some admitted they had doubted me. Others confessed he had spoken to them in ways that now seemed rehearsed, calculated. The notebook I had found in December 2022, filled with his fabricated accounts of my supposed instability, became central evidence. The judge studied it carefully, comparing his handwriting to letters and forms submitted previously. Piece by piece, his case unraveled in front of him. He tried to salvage it with theatrics. At one point, he raised his voice, gesturing at me with open hands, eyes glistening as though on the verge of tears. "I only ever wanted to help her. She is destroying me with these lies," the courtroom murmured. But then my lawyer played the May 11, 2023 audio, his calm, deliberate voice telling a friend how he planned to convince my sister I was confused, how he would handle me. The contrast was devastating. His face drained of color as his own words dismantled the performance. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt taller, though exhaustion dragged at my bones. My sister grabbed my hand, her eyes bright with tears. "He can't hide anymore," she said. For the first time, I allowed myself a fragile smile. But deep inside, I knew battles leave marks, even after they are won. June 2024 was the month I moved into my own apartment again. A small one-bedroom near Vila Mariana, with peeling paint but a balcony that caught the morning sun. Carrying my boxes up the narrow stairs, I felt a strange mix of triumph and grief. This was the first space in years that was mine alone, untouched by his presence. I set up my bed, placed my mother's old lamp by the window, and for the first night in a long time, I slept without fear of hearing his key turn in the lock. Still, when the wind rattled the glass, I woke with a jolt, heart racing. Healing, I learned, is not linear. It is a spiral. You return to the same fears until one day, they no longer cut as deep. By July, Exactly a year after that day in the clinic, when he tried to have me committed, the final hearing was set. The courthouse felt less intimidating now, though the smell of disinfectant and paper still clung to the air. The judge spoke firmly. The evidence was clear. The audios, the notebook, the psychiatrist's statement, the timeline of receipts and texts, all pointed to a pattern of manipulation, coercion, and false accusations. His attempt to portray me as unstable was dismissed as unfounded. The restraining order was extended. His countersuits dissolved under the weight of his contradictions. As the words sank in, I looked at him one last time. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting like a cornered animal. For years, he had been the narrator of my life, dictating how others saw me, how I saw myself. In that moment, stripped of control, he looked small. Not the powerful architect of lies I had feared, but a man exposed by the very tools he had tried to use against me. Leaving the courthouse, I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I walked into the afternoon sun, São Paulo bustling as if nothing monumental had happened. But for me, the air felt different. Lighter. Real. I was no longer living in a story someone else wrote for me. The truth was mine again. Carved out of pain. Yes. But also resilience. That night, sitting on my balcony, I opened the folder called Truth. For the first time, I considered deleting it. Not out of fear, but out of release. I didn't need the files to prove anything anymore. The world had heard. My family had seen. The court had ruled. My reality no longer needed defending. I closed the laptop and whispered into the night air, "You tried to call me crazy, but in the end, your voice saved me." And in that silence, for the first time in years, I felt whole. After the verdict in July 2024, people thought I would celebrate. Some expected me to throw a dinner, to toast with wine, to laugh like someone who had just been pulled from a burning building. But the truth was different. The fire may have ended, but the smoke lingered in my lungs. Freedom is complicated. It comes with silence that feels too wide, with rooms that echo because you've gotten used to someone else filling the air. Even if that someone was your jailer. Moving into my new apartment was supposed to be a symbol of victory. I bought a secondhand couch, pale blue, with a tear in the fabric on the side. I placed it against the wall beneath a painting my mother had given me years ago. I told myself this was a fresh start. But the first night I slept there alone, I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard the sound of keys turning in the lock. It took me minutes to calm down, to remind myself the locks were changed, the restraining order in place, his control broken. Trauma lingers like that. It teaches your body to expect invasion, long after the invader is gone. During the day, I tried to build normalcy. I took the metro to work, carried groceries home in thin plastic bags, watered the plants on my balcony. Yet, in every ordinary task, I felt both the weight of what I'd survived and the lightness of no longer living under his shadow. Sometimes, in the market, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear in the fruit aisle with that carefully concerned smile. Other times, I realized hours had passed without thinking of him at all, and those were the moments that felt like real freedom. Friends returned, some cautiously, some with guilt heavy in their eyes. Camilla invited me to lunch in late August, and we sat in the same cafe where I had first played her the audio. This time, the table between us held only coffee cups, no phone recording buzzing like a bomb. "I'm sorry," she said again, "for doubting you, for letting him control the narrative." I looked at her and realized forgiveness was part of my healing too, not for him, but for those who had been swept up in his lies. Family healing took longer. My father, now fully on my side, struggled with his shame. In September, on a Sunday afternoon, we sat together in his garden, the smell of wet earth rising after a brief rain. He fiddled with his glasses, avoiding my gaze. I wanted to believe him because he seemed so stable. "And you were so tired from your mother's illness, from work." It fit his story. "I'm sorry, Filha." I placed my hand over his. "He fooled all of us. That's what people like him do." My father nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. It was the first time I saw him cry since my mother's diagnosis. But the hardest conversations were with myself. I kept asking, how did I let it happen? How did I allow someone to narrate me out of my own life? The answer wasn't simple. Love had blinded me. Yes. Gratitude had tied me down. Yes. But more than that, I had believed the world when it told me women should be patient, forgiving, understanding. That love was sacrifice. That suspicion was disloyalty. He had weaponized those beliefs until I barely recognized myself. Therapy helped. In October 2024, I began sessions with a psychologist near Paraiso. The office smelled of lavender and old books, a far cry from the clinical chill of the psychiatrist's room where he had once tried to trap me. There, I learned that what I endured had a name: gaslighting, coercive control, psychological abuse. Naming it didn't erase it, but it gave it shape, and anything with shape can be confronted. One evening, my therapist asked, "When you listen to the recordings now, what do you hear?" I thought about it for a long moment. I hear his voice, yes, but mostly I hear mine. I hear myself refusing, questioning, pushing back even when I was scared. I thought I was weak, but those audios prove I wasn't. She smiled. Exactly. You survived by remembering when he tried to make you forget. By November 2024, the whispers around me began to fade. The story was no longer fresh gossip. It had settled into the background of people's lives. That anonymity was healing. I could walk through the city again without feeling like a case study. At the same time, I realized my story had become something larger than me. When I spoke at the women's support group again, more people came. Some shared their own stories, their own recordings, their own notebooks filled with lies uncovered. I wasn't just surviving for myself anymore. I was surviving for them too. But even as the wounds healed, scars remained. I struggled to trust new people, to let them close. When a man at work asked me out for coffee in December, my chest tightened with both curiosity and fear. Could I ever risk giving someone else the power to narrate me again? I didn't answer him right away. I took my time, because now I understood that my voice was not something to hand over lightly. The reflection came full circle on New Year's Eve, 2024. I stood on my balcony, fireworks exploding over São Paulo, the city alive with shouts and music. I thought of July 18th, 2023. The clinic, the form, the buzzing light, the plastic cup bending in my hand. I thought of the notebook wrapped in the scarf, the chipped kitchen table, the whispered lies that almost erased me. And then I thought of the audios, my secret lifeline, my shield, my proof. They had saved me, not just in court, but in my own mind. I whispered into the night. You called me crazy, but your voice became the proof that I was sane all along. The fireworks cracked the sky open, light spilling over the rooftops. For the first time, I felt not just like a survivor, but like the author of my own life again. And that was the deepest truth of all. Survival was never about silencing his voice. It was about amplifying mine. Closure is not a straight road. It is a labyrinth. Even after the final gavel fell in court and the restraining order was renewed indefinitely, even after my father's hand stopped trembling when he touched my shoulder, even after my sister began calling me the strongest person I know, with a conviction that once belonged only to doubt, I discovered that endings are never clean. They are stitched together with both peace and pain. In January 2025, I deleted the truth folder from my laptop. For months, I had hovered over it, finger trembling above the delete key, as though the files were an oxygen tank I still needed to breathe. But I realized something important. The truth no longer needed proof. It lived in the people who had heard it, in the judge's ruling, in the witnesses who had admitted their mistakes. More importantly, it lived in me. I didn't need recordings to convince myself anymore. I had learned to trust my own memory again. The moment the progress bar filled and the folder vanished, I cried. Not tears of grief, but tears of release. The past was still part of me, but it no longer held me hostage. Life after survival is strange. You expect joy to come rushing in like sunlight through open windows, But often what enters first is emptiness. I woke each morning in my small apartment, made coffee in the chipped mug I'd carried from place to place, and felt both gratitude and a hollow ache. Who am I now without the battle? For years, my identity had been forged in resistance, resisting his lies, resisting the label of madness, resisting the silence others tried to impose. Now that resistance had given me back my voice, I had to ask, what else can I be besides a survivor? Therapy gave me fragments of answers. You are more than the wounds, my therapist said, her voice steady. But don't rush to erase them. They are part of your story, not the whole of it. I began writing again, not in secret folders, not in desperate notes hidden in laundry files, but in journals left openly on my desk. Words flowed without the fear of someone twisting them. Writing became not just survival, but creation. In March 2025, I was invited to speak at a conference on women's rights in São Paulo. Standing on a stage under bright lights, microphone in hand, I told my story. I began, not with the victory, but with the pain. July 18, 2023. A clinic. A form. A voice calling me paranoid. I saw faces in the audience stiffen, eyes fill with recognition. When I played a snippet of an audio, his voice pressing me, soft and insistent, an audible murmur swept the room. Afterward, women approached me, some with tears, some with rage, some with relief. One whispered, "You told my story too." That was when I understood the full circle. What he meant to silence had become a beacon. Still, scars speak. On quiet nights, when the city sleeps and the hum of distant traffic seeps through my balcony door, I hear echoes of his words. You're sick. You're confused. They don't cut anymore. But they remind me. They remind me how fragile reality can be when someone determined chips away at it piece by piece. They remind me never to doubt the voice inside me again. In May 2025, almost 2 years after that first attempt to lock me away, I visited the clinic again. I walked past the eucalyptus smell, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the same cold vinyl chairs. The nurse at the desk didn't recognize me. I wasn't there as a patient, not as someone accused, but as a woman who had returned to stand where fear had almost swallowed her whole. I sat for a moment, let the air fill my lungs, then stood and left. The past no longer had teeth sharp enough to bite me there. The greatest lesson was not about him, but about me. I had survived not because I was fearless, but because I remembered. He tried to rewrite my story, line by line, whisper by whisper. But memory, when protected, when preserved, is a weapon. My audios, my notes, my fragments of truth, they were my rebellion. And even when I doubted myself, some small part of me knew I was worth defending. Now, when I walk through São Paulo's crowded streets, when I hear the chatter of strangers, when I smell roasted peanuts from vendors on the corners, I carry myself differently. My shoulders are straighter. My eyes meet others without flinching. I am no longer the woman who curled inward under suspicion. I am the woman who took lies and turned them into evidence, who took manipulation and turned it into testimony, who took silence and turned it into a voice. To anyone who listens now, I say, if they call you crazy, remember this. Truth does not vanish because someone labels it madness. Truth waits. It waits in the shadows, in files, in memories, in the spine of your being. And one day, when the moment comes, truth speaks. He tried to bury me in silence, but I recorded the sound of his shovel, and in the end, it was not me who was buried. It was his lie. As I close this chapter, I no longer whisper to the night. I speak aloud into daylight, into crowded streets, into microphones, into journals. I am not what you called me. I am not the shadow you painted. I am not erased. I am here. I remember. And I am free.